Picture this, you're standing in a forest clearing outside Rome in 105 BCE. You're 17 years old, malnourished, exhausted from days of forced march. Around you stand 30 other recruits, all of you stripped to tunics despite the February cold. In front of you, a Roman centurion holds a wooden gladius. He's going to attack you with full force, with killing intent. And if you fail to defend yourself correctly, if you hesitate, if you show fear, you won't join the legions. You'll be sent home in disgrace if you survive at all. This is the Probatio, the recruitment test that turned Roman citizens into the most effective killing machine in ancient history. And everything you think you know about it is sanitized mythology designed to make ancient warfare seem noble instead of what it actually was. Industrial-scale brutality that began by breaking recruits so completely that reforming them into soldiers became possible. Right now, in museum archives across Europe, there are military discharge documents, training manuals, and medical records that reveal exactly what the Probatio entailed. And historians have been remarkably reluctant to discuss the specifics, because what Rome did to its own citizens during recruitment makes modern military training look gentle by comparison. Let me be direct, you wouldn't pass. I wouldn't pass. Statistically, at least 40% of the young men who presented themselves for the Probatio were rejected outright. Not because they were too weak or too cowardly, but because the test was designed to identify not just physical capability but psychological malleability. The Romans needed men who could be rebuilt, men who would obey orders that violated every human instinct for self-preservation. And the Probatio was how they found those men. Here's what we know for certain from Vegetius's military manual and fragmentary accounts from Polybius and Livy. The Probatio wasn't a single test. It was a multi-day ordeal that assessed height, vision, physical strength, social background, and most critically, response to violence and humiliation. Recruits were measured. If you were under 5 Roman feet 6 inches tall, you were rejected immediately. Your vision was tested by making you identify objects at increasing distances, while centurions screamed threats inches from your face. Then came the physical assessments. Forced marches carrying 60 pounds of equipment, swimming tests in full armor, endurance runs that lasted until men collapsed. But that was just the preliminary culling. The recruits who remained faced something worse. Listen carefully to what the sources actually describe. Vegetius mentions that recruits were subjected to harsh correction during probatio to test their capacity for discipline. That's military language obscuring what actually happened. Other sources are more explicit. Polybius describes recruits being beaten with vine staffs, the same implement centurions used to maintain discipline in the legions, to gauge their reactions. Were you stoic? You passed. Did you cry out? You failed. Did you raise your hands to protect yourself before being ordered to do so? You failed. The test wasn't measuring pain tolerance, it was measuring obedience. Your willingness to accept violence without resistance. Your capacity to override survival instincts and submit to authority even when that authority was hitting you hard enough to break ribs. Now understand what this means in practice. These were Roman citizens, freeborn men with legal rights, and the state was systematically brutalizing them as an entrance requirement for military service. This wasn't punishment for wrongdoing, this was standard procedure, expected, celebrated even, because Rome understood something that makes modern people deeply uncomfortable. Effective soldiers aren't born. They're created through trauma, controlled and directed by institutional authority. The probatio broke you first. Only then could the legions rebuild you into something useful. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The beatings weren't the worst part. Archaeological evidence from training camps and medical analyses of skeletal remains from Roman military cemeteries reveal patterns of injury consistent with deliberately inflicted violence during initial training. Fractured noses, broken fingers, dental trauma, cracked ribs, these weren't combat injuries, they're found in remains of recruits who died during training before ever seeing battle. Young men aged 15 to 20, showing evidence of systematic physical brutality that occurred in controlled settings under supervision. This wasn't accidental, this was pedagogical. Rome was teaching recruits that their bodies didn't belong to them anymore. That pain was something to be endured, not avoided. That authority's demands superseded physical integrity. Read the discharge documents carefully, the diplomata that survive on bronze tablets in museums across Europe. They record names, ranks, legion assignments, years of service. But notice what they don't record. There's no mention of the thousands of young men who presented for probatio and disappeared from the historical record entirely. Not rejected, not sent home, just gone. Where did they go? Some died during the testing itself from exposure, exhaustion, injuries inflicted during combat assessments. Others were deemed suitable for different purposes. There are fragmentary references in military accounts to recruits who passed to auxiliary service or were assigned to labor cohorts, meaning they were still pressed into service but not as legionaries. They became the support infrastructure, road builders, camp followers, logistics personnel. The men who weren't quite broken enough to be combat soldiers but were still exploited by the military machine. Now here's the part historians rarely discuss openly. The Probatio included sexual vulnerability testing. Yes, you read that correctly. Polybius and later sources describe recruits being subjected to situations designed to assess their responses to dominance and submission. Forced nudity, intimate physical examinations conducted publicly. Humiliation rituals that tested whether recruits would resist or comply when placed in degrading positions. Modern scholars use euphemistic language about testing moral character and assessing discipline under duress. But when you examine the actual descriptions and compare them to anthropological studies of military initiation practices across cultures, the pattern is unmistakable. Rome was identifying which recruits would submit to total authority, including sexual authority, because that psychological profile predicted obedience in combat situations where self-preservation would otherwise cause men to flee. This isn't speculation. This is documented in sources that historians have spent centuries trying to contextualize away. Suetonius describes military training practices under various emperors that included rituals modern readers would immediately recognize as sexual abuse. Tacitus mentions soldiers being tested in all capacities during recruitment. The language is coded, but the meaning becomes clear when you understand Roman military culture. The legions weren't creating soldiers through inspiration and patriotism. They were creating soldiers through systematic trauma and conditioning. And it worked. Roman legions were the most effective military force in the ancient world for 5 centuries. Not because Roman citizens were naturally superior warriors, but because Rome had perfected the science of turning civilians into men who would march into enemy spear formations on command. Consider the combat assessment portion of the Probatio. Recruits faced trained gladiators or veteran soldiers in controlled combat scenarios using wooden weapons. The goal wasn't to win. The goal was to demonstrate proper technique while being genuinely attacked. Vegetius describes recruits practicing against wooden posts called man-height stakes that they would strike thousands of times to build muscle memory. But during Probatio, you weren't hitting an inanimate post. You were facing a man actively trying to hurt you, and if your defense was inadequate, you got hurt. Broken bones were common. Concussions were expected. Some recruits died. And this was considered acceptable attrition. The logic was brutal but effective. Better to eliminate inadequate soldiers during testing than have them fail in actual combat and get entire units killed. Track what happened to the recruits who passed. They entered a training regimen that makes modern boot camp look like summer vacation. 4 months of continuous drilling, 6 hours per day in full armor. Forced marches of 20 miles carrying 80 pounds of equipment, completed in 5 hours. Swimming in full armor. Weapons training until hands bled and shoulders dislocated from repetitive striking. And throughout all of this, the beatings continued. Centurions carried vine staffs specifically for striking recruits who made mistakes. Discipline was maintained through violence, constantly applied, never questioned. The message was clear. Your body is an instrument of the state. Your suffering is irrelevant. Your obedience is everything. And here's what the sources reveal when you read them carefully. The psychological consequences were catastrophic. Veterans' accounts, rare but they exist, describe emotional numbing, inability to form civilian relationships, chronic nightmares, explosive violence. Modern psychologists would diagnose PTSD. Romans called it being hardened by Mars. The language was different, but the condition was identical. Rome created soldiers through trauma, and that trauma never fully healed. Military discharge documents sometimes note that veterans were unsuitable for civilian life. Bureaucratic language for men so damaged by military conditioning that they couldn't reintegrate into society. These men often became brigands, mercenaries, or simply died young from violence or suicide. The Roman military machine consumed them and then discarded them when they were no longer useful. But Rome didn't just destroy individuals. The Probatio system created social consequences that historians have been reluctant to fully examine. By making military service both mandatory for citizenship rights and contingent on passing a deliberately traumatic test, Rome created a two-tier society. Men who passed became full citizens with political rights and social status. Men who failed, or who were too intelligent to volunteer in the first place, became second-class citizens, economically and politically marginalized. The system perpetuated itself by making the privilege of citizenship dependent on willingness to submit to state violence. And because military service was glorified in Roman culture, young men competed for the opportunity to be brutalized. They volunteered, they begged for the chance to prove themselves through suffering. The Probatio wasn't forced on unwilling conscripts. It was desired by citizens who had been conditioned to view trauma as virtue. Understand the machinery that made this possible. Rome wasn't an outlier. Every successful military culture in history has developed similar systems. Spartan agoge, Mongol-breaking rituals, Japanese samurai training. Modern military boot camps. The specifics vary, but the underlying logic remains constant. Civilian psychology must be destroyed before military psychology can be installed. The methods might be refined, might be repackaged with less overtly brutal language, but the function is identical. Take young people at their most vulnerable developmental stage. Subject them to controlled trauma. Remove individual identity. Rebuild them as obedient instruments of state violence, and call it honor. The Probatio worked because it identified not the strongest or the bravest, but the most psychologically malleable. The recruits who could watch their peers being beaten and think, that could be me without breaking. The recruits who could endure sexual humiliation and compartmentalize the experience. The recruits who could kill the person they used to be and become the person Rome needed them to be. Those men built an empire. They also destroyed countless lives, including their own. The cost of Roman military supremacy wasn't paid primarily by Rome's enemies. It was paid by the Roman citizens who volunteered for the privilege of being systematically broken and rebuilt as instruments of imperial violence. And before you congratulate yourself on living in more enlightened times, look carefully at modern military recruitment and training practices. The language has changed. The explicit brutality has been moderated, mostly. But the underlying logic remains. Break recruits psychologically. Condition obedience through controlled stress. Create soldiers who will override survival instincts and execute orders even when those orders guarantee death. We've gotten better at hiding the machinery. We haven't changed what the machinery does. The definitive truth is this: you wouldn't pass the Probatio. Not because you're weak, but because you haven't been conditioned since childhood to view trauma as virtue. You haven't internalized the logic that makes systematic brutality seem like honor. You still believe your body belongs to you, that your psychological integrity matters, that suffering isn't something to pursue but something to avoid. And by Roman standards, those beliefs would make you unsuitable for military service. Not because they're wrong, but because they're incompatible with the kind of obedience that effective military organizations require. The Probatio didn't test courage. It tested your capacity to abandon self-preservation and submit to authority even when that authority was destroying you. Rome needed men who could do that. You probably can't. Be grateful for that incapacity. The recruits who passed the Probatio became legionaries. They conquered territories, suppressed rebellions, enforced imperial policy through violence. They also lived shorter lives, died more violent deaths, and experienced psychological damage that never healed. The Roman military machine worked efficiently for centuries. It also consumed everyone it touched: recruits, enemies, and eventually Rome itself when the system became too expensive to maintain and collapsed under its own brutality. If you want to understand more about how ancient systems of organized violence shape civilizations, hit that subscribe button on Mythbusting. We're going to keep examining the uncomfortable machinery that historical narratives prefer to romanticize or ignore entirely. So what brutal historical practice should we investigate next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below.